Hey internets, so recently James Lindsay has been going off on libertarianism again, in a series of X posts that can effectively be summarized as the meme. Well, if your ideology is correct, then why do I aggressively misunderstand what you actually believe? If you don't know who that is, he's the same guy who's behind the Grievance Studies affair, as well as the guy who's behind New Discourses. Which is actually pretty good work, to be honest. Which is why I'm going to be refuting these takes in good faith, also because a lot of what he has to say is really just standard general issues with libertarianism that your general standard conservative liberal types tend to have. And so that's what this video really is going to be, is explaining a lot of the things about libertarian philosophy that people tend to get wrong. Because one white pill I've realized about libertarian philosophy is that a lot of standard conservatives who have problems with libertarianism, well, those contentions don't really come from a genuine dislike of libertarian theory. Rather, a lot of it comes from misunderstandings of the theory that is partially not entirely their fault. Part of it comes from people calling themselves libertarians despite not actually being so. Like, for example, left libertarians who are in fact just neo-Marxists who are basically bootlickers for the state, which then of course causes confusion about libertarianism, because then the general conservatives might see that and they will incorrectly conclude that, oh, that means that the Mises Caucus is also a neo-Marxist movement, which is just completely incorrect. And so a lot of times when you set things straight and explain, no, that's not what libertarian theory is, this is what libertarian theory is, a lot of times you can actually shake a neocon back to reality. So hopefully this video will answer a lot of questions that a lot of people tend to have about this philosophy, while also showcasing why a lot of otherwise very intelligent and well-educated people tend to fall for a lot of straw man arguments about what libertarian theory actually is. Anyways, let's get things started with misunderstanding Hans Hermann Hoppe. Alright, in case you wonder what's up with them, all these idiot libertarian accounts, Comic Dave Smith, Tom Woods, Libertarian Party, are huge devotees of noted Jew hater Hans Hermann Hoppe, who believed Marx was correct about everything. So yeah, starting off with a false accusation, along with a very severe misunderstanding of Hoppe's essay on Marxist and Austrian class analysis. Let's just start with the accusation of anti-Semitism. There is zero evidence that Hans Hermann Hoppe specifically and uniquely dislikes the Jews. Everything he has ever said in regards to ethnicity are general things painted with a broad brush, nothing actually specific. The only thing that comes close is that Hoppe has criticized Zionism and has criticized the Israeli government, but that doesn't count unless, of course, you go with what's called the new definition of anti-Semitism, where criticism of Israeli government policy is extended to all Jews, which has been repeatedly shown to be a completely ridiculous argument. You can absolutely criticize the government of a state without it counting as lay racism against the majority ethnicity that lives within that state, like for example the CCP. People criticize the Chinese Communist Party all the time, and much of that criticism comes from Falun Gong, who, if you're familiar with them, are largely Chinese. And of course, there are many Jews who are critical of the Israeli government as well. This is a textbook example of the fallacy of division. Just because someone is criticizing one part does not mean they're criticizing the whole part. But of course, this is just an X post, and Lindsay didn't elaborate on why he believes that Hoppe is a notorious Jew hater or something. But regardless of whether it's the new definition of anti-Semitism, or believing that he's genuinely said anti-Jewish things, both of them are false for different reasons. So let's just move on to the next and honestly more interesting problem, which is thinking that Hoppe is saying that Marx is correct about everything here. This is a perfect example of why you can't just read the first page of an essay and assume that you understand the essay from that first page. Because if you actually read Hoppe's entire essay on Marxist and Austrian class analysis, you will realize that the first page of it is actually bait. Because it first appears that Hoppe is saying that the Marxist theory of history is completely correct, claiming that you can, in fact, describe history in terms of class rule, class struggle, and exploitation. But there's a very important part of this that people who are just skim reading this or assuming they understand it from the first page are completely missing, which is hinted at right here. Hoppe writes, "I will demonstrate how Austrianism in the Mises-Rothbard tradition can give a correct, but categorically different explanation of their validity, that they are derived in Marxism from a false starting point." So just a little English comprehension 101 here. This kind of negative framing means that the only thing Hoppe is handing to Marxism is that human society does have parasites in it that do engage in some kind of exploitation. But he's not actually agreeing with Marxists in how specifically those things are defined. What's going on here is that Hoppe is writing it this way with it in the first page, just to, again, bait Marxists into reading it. See, the thing you have to understand about Hoppe, something I noticed when reading a lot of his work, is that Hoppe views Marxism as a false cure. The fundamentals of Karl Marx, at their core, is really just the recognition that something is wrong with society, that there are people out there who are doing things to others that can arguably be seen as objectively evil and wrong, and yet our society accepts it anyways, and this acceptance is part of the reason why modern society still has a lot of problems. And because Marxists misidentify what specifically that problem is, they create an entire philosophy that is essentially nonsensical, but at the same time very attractive, because it gives people an explanation for why certain things are a certain way that answers a lot of questions that a lot of people have about why society seems so unfair at times. And you can see this right away in his essay again on the second page. Hoppe writes, unfortunately, however, it is Marxism which subscribes to all of them in regards to all of these theories of exploitation and class that has done more than any other ideological system to discredit their validity. Or in other words, what Hoppe is saying here in regards to class and exploitation is defined completely differently than what Marxists are talking about. You see, Marxists define exploitation as through the process of extracting what they call surplus labor value, which of course relies on the labor theory of value, that it's entirely created off the back of the worker. And so thus they see it as when the product of the worker's labor is, say, $100 in value, and the boss only pays the worker $20, then it is said that the boss has stolen roughly $80 from him. That's effectively how Marxists see it. That's a very basic rudimentary concept of LTV anyway. In this view, the boss takes advantage of the fact that they own the means of production in order to exploit the worker, viewing it as no different as the system of slavery of old, other than the fact that it's been privatized. Now, Hoppe very strongly disagrees with this theory and actually just calls it patently absurd. Reading further into the essay, Hoppe points out that the reason the worker agrees to this kind of arrangement is because his wage payment represents present goods, while his own labor services represent only future goods. And so what Hoppe is really talking about here is just the phenomenon of time preference, and recognizing that time itself has a value and that generally future goods are not worth the same as a present good. For example, if you had the choice given right now to be given a house for free immediately, or to be given a voucher which will give you the same house for free again in another 10 years from now, which will you pick? Will you pick to have the house for free, or will you pick to have the house, same exact house, no tricks here? Would you rather have the same exact house for free in 10 years instead of now? Well, obviously, you'd rather have it now, as that represents 10 additional years of being able to use it. But it also makes sense from the standpoint of investment. Would you rather be paid $100 now, or would you rather be paid $100 5 months from now? Well, obviously, it's of course more valuable to you now. And the fun thing about this comes up when you consider the fact that you can auction these things off. Auction a product off worth whatever value, and then auction a voucher off for the exact same product. And of course, what's going to happen is every single time, pretty much, the prospect of having it now will auction off for a higher price than the price of a voucher that will entitle you to the exact same product later. And you can see the difference in that value increase as the amount of time increases. Make it a year for the voucher, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. As you go higher and higher, the value of that voucher will decrease, especially if you increase the time so much that it extends beyond the average lifetime of a human lifespan. Then the voucher becomes almost near worthless, except for those who would wish to will it to their offspring. And so going back to the factory worker and, say, the factory owner, the typical case that the Marxists will complain about, really the factory worker is agreeing to work under these conditions so that the worker does not have to take the time, the risk, and the investment, and the time for all of that to pay off to go and build his own factory. And that therefore comparing this relationship to that of the slave and the master is invalid, because the relationship of the worker and the factory owner is in fact a mutually beneficial one. This is not agreeing with what Marx had to say at all. It's actually a direct refutation of it. This is why you need to read the whole article sometimes. It becomes very obvious at this point why Hoppe wanted to bait Marxists into reading this. Because the thing is, if you know Marxists, you know that they really hate to read any kind of theory that goes against their own dogma. And so what Hoppe's really done here is he's tricked them into reading a refutation of their theory by kind of pretending to agree with them at the start. But then of course he's only agreeing with it in so as far as their basic rhetoric. But he's actually completely disagreeing with how they define class and how they define exploitation. And since those things are at the heart of what Marxism is, because the theory effectively falls apart without Marx's class theory and without the labor theory of value, this is definitely not Hoppe thinking that Marx was correct about everything. Very far from it. It is, again, as I said earlier, bait. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, what is Hoppe proposing as an alternative to this theory? Well, in regards to exploitation, Hoppe writes that exploitation is the expropriation of homesteaders, producers, and savers by late-coming non-homesteaders, non-producers, non-savers, and non-contractors. Or in other words, it's about property rights, people whose claims to property are derived from thin air and who disregard others' work and contract. You know, kind of like a thief, or a murderer, or let's say an army of barbarians coming into a village to use force and violence to extract the goods by which they created without any kind of voluntary contract involved. Which actually does make sense to define human history of conflict by this, because he's defining exploitation by the very act of creating conflict. And through this theory of exploitation, we also derive a completely different theory of class. What Hoppe is alluding to here is effectively known as the non-productive class theory. Whereas instead of simply looking at class as a case of owners and workers, or a divide between the rich and the poor, instead we're looking at a divide from people who get their resources through voluntary interaction and people who get their resources from non-voluntary interaction. Assuming that you are an honest citizen, most of the goods that you have in your home are probably things that you voluntarily worked for and voluntarily bought. Most of them, at least. And a thug who then breaks into your home to steal those goods is thus extracting the product of your work without your voluntary consent. That, in essence, is the non-productive class. And yes, that, in essence, is also the human history of conflict. Just about every single conflict in human history can be defined by this type of criminal behavior, in one way or another, scaled to various degrees. And you will also notice that this kind of class theory scales starting from the individual. It is not a necessarily collectivist class theory, and thus does not require any belief in any sort of collective guilt. It is instead rooted almost entirely at the level of whether or not a person uses aggression to get what they want, or if they're offering their goods and services freely only to those who agree to pay for them. This is a class theory that's rooted in the thinking of some old French philosophers and some Austrian philosophers who are ultimately mostly free market thinkers. So again, another very big way that Hoppe is disagreeing with Marx. Because from this difference in opinion between what specifically exploitation and what specifically class is, and how these things cause conflict, the major differences between the Austrian school and neo-Marxists today is that neo-Marxists are socialists, while those of the Austrian school are free marketeers, heavily in favor of capitalism. And we see this today in the progressive neo-Marxist movement, where most of them generally just vote for increased regulation and increased taxes to pay for entitlements, strangling the market with the hands of the state. Whereas the Austrian school actually views the state itself as members of the non-productive class, due to the fact that taxation is theft. And so thus it is argued that there needs to be less state involvement, as the very existence of the non-productive class incentivizes the existence of corruption, and that the more capitalism is clean of this, the better it functions, which, by the way, has historically been proven to be correct. Hoppe calls this clean capitalism, and we can clearly see that this is what he is arguing by this statement right here. Where Hoppe writes, competition within the ruling class and among different ruling classes brings about a tendency towards increasing concentration. Marxism is right in this, however, its faulty theory of exploitation again leads it to locate the cause for the tendency in the wrong place. Marxism sees such a tendency as inherent in capitalist competition, yet it is precisely so long as people are engaged in a clean capitalism that competition is not a form of zero-sum interaction. The homesteader, the producer, saver, and contractor do not gain at another's expense. Or to put everything very simply, TLDR, Hoppe is basing his class theory on those who are criminals and those who are not, and exploitation is more on the very act of expropriation of property that is not rightfully yours. Which of course it also comes with a completely different ethical theory. So very totally different from what Marx is saying. Which then allows us to move on to the next thing that Lindsay had to say. Taking something said by Texas and Cap. Ah yes, governments wanting to control more of the world so they manufacture threats to justify war. To which Lindsay replies by comparing that to other various cringe theories, who kind of say something similar, like communists also saying, ah yes, capitalists and imperialists wanting to control more of the world so they manufacture threats to justify war, and how CRT and feminists and third worldists, Palestinians, and critical America theory, I guess, all say very similar things, accusing their boogeyman of wanting to control more of the world, and thus they manufacture threats to justify war. However, this is a false comparison, and for a very simple reason, which is that the libertarians are correct. And the comparison is faulty, because the problem with all the others is that they're looking at largely through a collectivist framework, whereas the libertarian is looking at it from the perspective of identifying the incentive structure of how the non-productive class works, and how that happens at an individual level. So for example, feminists accusing men of manufacturing threats to justify war to control the world is incorrect, because there's no specific incentive for quote-unquote the men or the patriarchy to actually do this. And also, as I pointed out in one of my previous videos of the collectivist fallacy, the collective mind of the men is not a concretely real thing. However, when it comes to government, we're not really talking about the government as a collective, but rather just their participation in the non-productive class. You see, an issue when it comes to war and the state is that there is a conflict of interest which allows them to profit off of war. The way it works in the United States, at least, is that the government funds the private and name-only production of military weapons and supplies, all on taxpayer dime, which, again, taxation is theft. And then through having a revolving door relationship with those companies, individual politicians are then able to join in and reap the profits. And thus, an incentive is born for our politicians to justify war. They have to justify it by having a regular need to use and produce these weapons. As well, of course, the incentives of controlling different regions. But this incentive structure is generally what's often called the military-industrial complex, which ordinarily this wouldn't really be that profitable, but because taxpayer funds do not need to be voluntarily forfeited, the government is able to push a much larger amount of funding towards it, allowing them to fund trillions of dollars into a project without people really understanding what's going on and just how much money is being wasted. Many people will argue that this is a conspiracy theory, but there are two major problems with that claim. The first is just that no one can deny that the incentives I just mentioned are objectively real incentives. If you are a politician and you have a financial stake in a private company that effectively earns profits off of the existence of war, then you ultimately have the incentive to exaggerate the need for war. Now, this alone wouldn't necessarily be proof of the military-industrial complex and its issues. We, of course, also need a smoking gun, which brings us to the second issue of calling it a conspiracy theory, which is that we can ask ourselves a very simple historical question, which is the question of, okay, have the government officials in this specific position exaggerated the needs for war in the past? And the answer, very sadly, is absolutely yes. For example, it is now known that the Lyndon B. Johnson administration misled people about the justifications for the Vietnam War, primarily how the August 4th attack just didn't really happen. And then, of course, there's the Iraq War. I think we all kind of still remember that one. There were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction found. Iraq was just a paper tiger the whole time. And then, of course, you've got the Afghanistan War. Aside from just the utter failure of trillions of dollars to replace the Taliban with more Taliban, WikiLeaks exposed how hundreds of government statements didn't match the evidence, with the Taliban's ability to mount an attack on the United States soil again being greatly exaggerated. And now here we are in the Iran War. The government spread propaganda and fear-mongering about most other wars in the last 100 years, but don't worry, this time they're totally telling the truth. Well, of course, this is a very large oversimplification, and there's a lot more to these wars than I just mentioned, obviously. The problem is, in each we can definitely objectively identify issues of exaggeration. And it doesn't really make sense why they would do this without taking into account the incentive structure that the military-industrial complex creates. Because when it comes to taxpayer dime, that's again a non-productive way to secure resources. If they were to go around and ask people to voluntarily fund these wars, they would be a lot more likely to question the information and justifications they were given, and of course there will be many conscientious objectors who will say no matter what. But in the case of taxation, the only thing they really have to fear is mass political unrest and mass protest, but ultimately those protesters are being forced to pay anyways. And so thus, they need to manufacture at least some base level of propaganda to exaggerate the threat. Even if the threat at a simple level is kind of real, they need to make it look big enough to avoid any kind of major issues. And this is true even for many of the politicians who aren't involved directly in the military-industrial complex. Because even if they personally aren't immediately profiting from this system, it's also just in general a good way to justify the existence of the non-productive class to the average normie. It basically is just another way to justify big government and justify the ballooning debt. Another thing to their benefit is that taxation really kind of hides just how much money they're funneling into this. For example, think of just how completely insane any one of these would be if it was a private company that was trusted with security. Like, for example, imagine if Securitas told their customers that they need trillions of dollars of funding to protect them from some mysterious threat or some kind of cult that is planning to destroy everybody. And it's completely unthinkable. Nobody would even begin to consider that as a real claim. Everyone would look at them like they're completely bananas. Shareholders would immediately demand overwhelming evidence, without which all of them would pull out because it would be seen as deeply unserious. And if in a world where security is privatized, we did find out that a company just completely manufactured a war this way and wasted trillions of dollars to replace a threat with the same threat, and then leave them alone because, well, it turns out they're not that big of a threat anyway, over the course of 20 years, people would be calling that fraud on a massive scale. People would be demanding the head of that CEO to be placed on a pike, because it's the government and they've effectively gaslit the population into believing that the non-productive class is necessary. The populace effectively suffers from a form of Stockholm syndrome, and thus justice for this massive scale fraud is never carried out. And so thus the era error of James Lindsay in his reasoning here, it's just a really silly false comparison. Libertarians are blaming a criminal for doing a criminal act, and Lindsay is saying, oh, well, isn't that just exactly the same as these other people who falsely accused an innocent party or some random, non-specific collective group for that crime? Therefore, the crime doesn't exist and libertarians are wrong. And well, no, we're not wrong because government officials have done this many times in the past. This is not a conspiracy theory, this is a statement of historical fact. And I know, I get it, a lot of times conservatives, general Republicans, they want to support our troops. They view that as being patriotic. But you have to consider, wouldn't it be more patriotic and more beneficial to your fellow Americans if when we went to war, we were going to war over legitimate things and not over exaggerated lies that get us into wars that aren't actually good, and ultimately prove to not actually be defensive wars? Because we're not saying that war itself is always bad. Self-defense on a national level does make sense if it is actually a genuine threat. But you have to consider the issue of the non-productive class here and the incentives that they have to manufacture those threats. And you can't deny them because we know, again, from historical fact, that they have indeed manufactured those threats. This is an objectively real problem that cannot be ignored. The government exaggerates threats in order to justify war, and many individual politicians and their allies can earn a profit off of it based on the structure of the system. You cannot deny that. That is a factually true statement. On that note, let's move on to statements of anarchy. Lindsay writes, while Hoppe believes in a magical stateless society like the communists, the problem is short-term feasibility. The communists offer the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat, and the libertarian Hoppe recommends a monarchy, lol. So this is another kind of common misconception with Hoppe, people thinking he's a monarchist. Mainly because it's mostly false, but not entirely false. Hoppe was more or less just arguing that monarchy is better than democracy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you believe that monarchy is good. However, there are elements of monarchy that do kind of jive a little bit more with libertarian theory than what you would normally expect. There are similarities to it, and that's why I've personally said in the past why libertarian monarchy as an actual ideology isn't that bad, or at the very least it's better than the current status quo. I recall I did a tier list where I personally ranked it in one of the higher tiers of political ideologies. And the reason for that actually has a little bit to do with the first part of what Lindsay gets incorrect here, which is thinking that the idea of a stateless society, as the Austrian school might propose it, is similar in any way to what the communists propose, when it is absolutely not. The issue here comes down to how they define the state. Leftists and communists, they define statism as really just the existence of authority in any kind of hierarchical structure. And so thus their big thing is that they oppose hierarchies, and that's how they consider themselves to be anarchists. Whereas the Austrian school more or less defines the state as simply being against aggression, or in other words, the abolition of the non-productive class. And so thus, in that system, hierarchy and authority and general rule of law are all considered good things, actually, so long as the citizens of a nation are voluntarily funding them. Like, for example, Hoppe defines a state as an agency that exercises a compulsory territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making, jurisdiction, and of taxation. And you'll also notice how he's also saying in pretty much the exact same paragraph, I am not a monarchist. So, Democracy, the God That Failed, this book is not supposed to be a book that defends monarchy. It's just using the argument that monarchy is better than democracy, and why it's better than democracy, to critique democracy. But this does not mean that monarchy is ideal. So why is it then that monarchy is seen somewhat closer to the libertarian theory than democracy? And well, there's a lot of reasons why, but one thing that needs to be pointed out is that it again just kind of boils down to the non-productive class. In fact, I would personally define a state as a territorial monopoly under the thumb of a non-productive class. That would probably make things a bit more consistent. Although Hoppe does imply that by saying taxation, it's pretty easy to get confused. Now, a monarchy is still a system where you have a non-productive class. In fact, in many ways, that's what a king is. The king gets to extract resources from other people's work, regardless of whether or not they want to. So that's still considered a non-productive class and still bad. The main difference, though, and the reason Hoppe kind of argues for democracy being worse than monarchy, has to do with how that non-productive class is owned. In the case of monarchy, the non-productive class, the state, is under private ownership, and under democracy, it's under public ownership. And a lot of people will think about it and immediately assume, well, okay, well, if there is a non-productive class, wouldn't it be better for us all to be owners of it? And the answer is absolutely not. That's actually one of the big mistakes of the modern day. Because there is no such thing as collective ownership. There is no collective mind. There is just individual positions occupying temporarily the non-productive class. It's tens of thousands of politicians who may or may not care about what the public thinks. Of course, they'll all say that they care, but they don't necessarily need to. And the issue with that really just comes down to two things: incentives and time preferences. A king has an actual greater incentive to ensure the functioning system of his kingdom lasts the length of his rule, and if it's a decent king, probably so that it will also last up to his dynasty. So that way the kingdom will remain a decent kingdom, a nice place to live for his children, who will also one day rule and take on the position of king. Or at least that's how it goes to the individual incentive of the king. I mean, just put yourself in the shoes of one. If you are a king of a great nation, and you one day want to pass on this great nation to your son, well, that alone is a pretty big immediate incentive to make sure that you rule as a decent king. But politicians are different. Politicians get voted in through a temporary measure to occupy that position for 4 years or so. And so their incentive from a personal level is to take advantage of that position that they've been temporarily granted, which means that they actually have less of an incentive to spend resources rationally. Another thing just comes down to corruption and being able to tell who specifically is at fault for the corruption. In a monarchy, you have significantly lower amounts of unelected, sort of unaccountable bureaucrats. Whereas in the public ownership of the non-productive class, you can have millions of them. And so you have no idea whenever you see corruption who exactly very specifically is at fault for the corruption without digging through miles of paperwork and through trudging through various connections within the power structures to see who actually is at fault for a problem. Whereas with a monarchy, it's a lot easier. A lot of times the problem when a nation is failing can just be directly blamed on the king in a monarchy situation, or at the very least it can be blamed on his closest advisors. And how this all relates to libertarian theory is that monarchy is just a little bit closer, because in the case of a libertarian society, say a libertarian nation, where there is no non-productive class, then you have privatization, but privatization of necessary government features such as defense and the courts, etc., etc. And it just so happens that that is a little bit more similar to how monarchy functions rather than democracy. And so, for example, one kind of libertarian society that could potentially exist in the future is a privately owned space colony. We have this large, artificial, technologically advanced rotating habitat. And this colony would effectively operate as a massive homeowners association. People who wanted to live there would pay for a plot of land within the habitat and agree to certain rules in order to keep the peace. The key thing here is that because they want to live there and they see the price tag of living there, it is a voluntary exchange. And so thus, in this case, the private owner or the CEO of this futuristic habitat, they don't own the people. The people living there are not his slaves. Rather, instead, they become customers. If he doesn't ensure that his colony is a nice place to live, then people will leave, or they just won't want to live there in the first place, and it would no longer be financially sustainable. And libertarians argue that this is effectively the best way for these societies to actually work. Effectively drafting a sort of pseudo-constitution and a rule of law based around the NAP and free market capitalism. Which then brings me to a bonus refutation here. A lot of standard conservatives, one of the contentions they have with libertarianism is that they think that libertarianism requires people to just. Like this one right here. Lone criticism, LMAO. Libertarianism is a child's ideology. Every belief they have is centered on if people would just, aka make believe. And if that was true, then yes, that would be a big problem. The people are not going to just. Any ideology or concept of a society that requires, oh well, what if all the people would just magically get along with each other? Well, yeah, that's obviously not going to work. You need to give people an incentive to do so, which is why pretty much every functioning civilization, or really just any kind of functioning organization, has rules and punishments for breaking those rules. Like, for example, your job. If you don't do your job, or if you do certain things wrong at your job, you get fired. At least assuming that you have a standard 9-to-5 job. But if you don't, that's kind of how it works. It's a private organization, and it works by something called freedom of association. Your job, the place that you work at, chooses to associate with you because you offer them some kind of benefit. You perform a certain task for them. And if you don't do it, they have no reason to pay you. And they have no reason to allow you to stay there on the premises. And the thing is, that's kind of effectively how libertarian theory works. I've said this before on my video on left anarchy. In terms of right anarchy, in the very different way that right anarchy is defined, as just being against the non-productive class, that doesn't necessarily mean no rules. There's still going to be rules and an incentive structure and a rule of law. It's just different in how it functions, with one of the big differences being that freedom of association is largely used, and so one of the big punishments you'll see is banishment. So for instance, returning to the example example of a futuristic space colony. If somebody moves in agreeing to live by the rule of peace and the nap, and then the first thing they do is murder their neighbor, well, ultimately that colony is going to have some kind of adjudication committee. And considering the extreme nature of their crime, the punishment can simply be getting yeeted out of the colony, spacesuit optional. Or perhaps for a less severe crime, it could also just simply be them not renewing their lease. A privately owned review board could look at what they did while they were a member of the colony, reach the conclusion that they were not a very good addition to, let's just say, refusing to clean up after their dog, and so thus they don't renew their lease. Towards the end, you now have to move out and find a different colony to live in, perhaps one that doesn't care if people pick up after their dog or not, and so thus the less pleasant people to be around will ultimately in this society find themselves surrounded with others like themselves. And that's just one of the many incentives by which people have to actually be decent people. It's not requiring everyone to just, purely by the goodness of their own heart. If you don't follow the nap in a libertarian society, you get shown the door. That's how it works. But anyway, going back to James Lindsay, I'll just end it on this post from him, criticizing the American Libertarian movement and party for getting captured by leftists some time ago. He said they aren't actually principled, they're useful idiots, most of the principled people left and discussed over the last decade. Now, this statement from Lindsay is actually partially correct. One problem with the Libertarian Party is that it's kind of in a bad position politically. A big difference between Republicans and Democrats and the Libertarian Party is that Republicans and Democrats are really just political parties that are masquerading as philosophies, whereas Libertarianism is an actual philosophy that's trying to find its place as a political party. And because of this, as well as the fact that it's kind of a small party, it opens the doors to a lot of what you could call pragmatism. However, comparing that to the two major parties, well, both Democrats and Republicans are inherently pragmatic. They don't actually believe in anything at all, which is far worse considering that they're parties that have some actual power behind them. But as far as what Lindsay points out here as leftists taking over the libertarian movement, that is very much untrue, or to be specific, it's kind of behind the curve of time. If you were to say that in the time of Gary Johnson or something, then yeah, admittedly, that might be a little true. But since the failure of what you could call left pragmatism, the libertarian movement, if anything, has a lot more GOP pragmatism. And I think what's happening here is that Lindsay is not only behind the curve, but I think he's just kind of basing this entirely on opposition to the Iran war. Just because libertarians and a lot of Democrats right now are both against the Iran war, that doesn't mean that libertarians have suddenly become leftists. In fact, ironically, it's exactly the opposite of this accusation here. Being against the Iran war entirely comes from a place of being principled. It's recognizing that the US unfortunately does have a history that needs to be acknowledged of exaggerating crimes in order to justify war, and that they take advantage of the fact that they can fund it through the non-productive class, and then when it turns out that they're lying, they don't get held accountable. We libertarians haven't really changed our position on this at all. In fact, what we're seeing right now is really the consequences of ignoring what the Mises Caucus had to say about funding unlimited taxpayer dollars to Israel, and how giving Tel Aviv and Netanyahu and co. a blank check on United States taxpayer dime was not actually incentivizing them to de-escalate the situation anytime soon. This was back when Biden was in charge, and now we are just seeing the consequences of that. Unless you want to argue that being against war is somehow a quote-unquote leftist principle, this is kind of a nonsensical argument, and trust me, that's not something you want to give to the left. Because leftists are absolutely not principled at all. Heck, the only real reason that they're against the war is simply because Trump's in office and Orange Man bad. They don't actually understand anything. I mean, let's be real for a minute here. Rather, the leftist anti-war mentality largely comes from a place of third worldist thinking, where they blame the fact that the third world is poor on imperialism from the first world. And so thus they tend to oppose a lot of wars based on that misguided thinking. I will, however, say that the libertarian movement does need to think about strategy a bit more, but it's specifically a way of how we can have strategy while still being principled, which will be a video for another day. But for now, that is all. Hopefully I've cleared some of the things up that James Lindsay had to say. TLDR, it's pretty much just an issue of you gotta actually read the entire essay, you gotta actually read Democracy, the God That Failed, and also for gaining a further understanding as to why the libertarian movement is not a left-wing movement, you could also read Hans Hermann Hoppe on getting libertarianism right. The point of this video was really to just give a TLDR of all of those things. But for now, that's all. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and if you want to support me, you can either tip me on Ko-Fi, or you can support me on Subscribestar or by becoming a member of the channel. But for now, that is all. Till next time.